It was mid-1968, deep in Phuoc Tui province. A patrol of the Australian SAS moved like shadows beneath the canopy. 6 men, faces painted, boots wrapped in cloth. Not a sound, not a ripple of movement betrayed their presence. For days, they had tracked faint signs, footprints too small to be male, cigarette ash where no patrol should have rested, the scent of cheap soap on a humid breeze. At first, they thought it was a trick. Then, in a clearing near a small stream, they found her. She was young, barely out of her teens. Mud streaked her face. Her eyes were wild with fear, and her hands trembled as she reached for a cloth-wrapped satchel slung over her shoulder. The SAS raised their weapons but did not fire. One trooper stepped forward and said in a firm but quiet voice, "You're safe now. No one will hurt you." She froze. Then slowly, she dropped the bag. Inside, morphine ampules, a notebook of hand-drawn maps, and a small pistol unfired. She was Viet Cong, likely a courier, perhaps a field medic. But what struck the men most wasn't her rank or the intelligence they might gather. It was the fear in her eyes and the dirt under her fingernails. She looked less like an enemy and more like someone's sister, someone's daughter. They didn't cuff her. They gave her water. And in that moment, between captor and captive, something changed. It wasn't just war anymore. It was 2 people, surviving in it. She was called Mai. At least, that was the name she gave them. It might have been real, or it might have been the name of someone she once knew and missed. In war, names had a way of shifting like shadows, trying to survive the light. The men of the Australian SAS didn't press her. They had captured enemy soldiers before hard, angry men who spat at the ground and shouted slogans through clenched teeth. But Mai was different. She didn't curse them. She didn't beg either. She sat quietly under the bamboo lean-to they had built, clutching a threadbare scarf and staring into the jungle as if trying to remember where she came from. The interpreter, an ARVN sergeant working alongside the SAS, spoke gently to her. Slowly, her story emerged. She was 19, born in a small village near the Mekong. Her father had been conscripted by the ARVN and died in an ambush. Her mother disappeared one day during a sweep operation. She was raised by her uncle, a schoolteacher turned political cadre. By 16, she had memorized maps and code phrases. By 17, she was in the jungle, moving supplies, patching wounds, writing down enemy movements. "I never shot anyone," she said. "I carried medicine, sometimes food, that was all." One of the troopers, quiet, older, maybe a farmer before the war, listened without judgment. He didn't speak Vietnamese, but he nodded when she spoke, and when she finished, he placed a small tin of condensed milk near her. She looked at it for a long time, then gave a single nod. Not thanks, not submission, just recognition. Mai didn't ask what would happen next. She likely already knew. Interrogation, detainment, transfer to the rear, maybe worse. But what surprised her was the way they treated her. Even now, she was the enemy, but not a thing, not an object, not a monster. They gave her food, a space to sleep, a canteen of water, a blanket when the wind turned cold at night. And in those quiet hours after capture, as the rain dripped steadily from the treetops and the radio whispered static in the background, Mai sat among them, surrounded by foreign men in camouflage, and wondered what kind of war this really was, because it wasn't what she had been told, and they weren't who she thought they would be. From the moment she was surrounded, Mai expected pain. She had been warned in the camps. If captured by Americans or their allies, she was to expect beatings, humiliation, interrogation with fists and fire. She had heard stories, some true, others bloated by fear. Women like her were told to bite their tongues until they bled, to resist, to hold firm, and if they could, to die before being taken. So when the tall men in green and brown stepped from the jungle with weapons drawn, she braced herself. She closed her eyes and waited for the blow. But it didn't come. Instead, one voice, calm, almost weary, asked her name. Another offered water. She opened her eyes, confused, as a hand gestured to sit down. No ropes, no shouting, just quiet professionalism. They searched her, gently but thoroughly, removing the pistol, the satchel, the maps. One soldier pocketed a tiny red diary and said nothing. No one rifled through it with mockery. No one spat at her. That night, as she sat near the small campfire the SAS had set up in a discreet, camouflaged site, she watched them from behind her knees. They barely spoke. They moved like hunters, but treated each other with easy trust. They took turns on watch. One man, possibly the medic, checked her wrist for pulse, noted her temperature, then nodded and walked away. In her training, Australians were described as brutal colonials, no different from the Americans, eager to kill, careless with civilians. But here, among these ghosts of the jungle, she felt not hatred but distance, not warmth, but something strangely human, restraint. They never smiled at her, but they never struck her either. The oldest one, whom she later learned was the patrol leader, looked at her like a farmer looking at ruined crops. Not hate, not revenge, just sorrow. The next morning, as they prepared to move her to a rear firebase, one of them handed her back the scarf Shed dropped. It had been cleaned in the stream, folded, still damp, a small act that broke something inside her. She looked up and met the eyes of the man. For a second, the war fell away. She didn't see the camouflage or the rifle slung over his shoulder. She just saw a tired man, not that different from her uncle, and in that moment, everything she thought she knew about the enemy began to blur. This wasn't surrender, this was confusion, and for the first time since she was a child, Mai felt something she didn't expect to feel in the hands of her enemy. Safety. To Mai, the jungle had always been a place of fear. It swallowed people. It hid death. It gave shelter to those who moved like whispers, and punished those who moved too fast. But the Australian soldiers who had captured her didn't move with fear. They moved with deliberate calm, like men who knew both the jungle and themselves. They rarely spoke. Orders were given with gestures. No wasted movement, no loud clicks of rifles, no careless chatter. She had seen other foreign troops loud, hasty, angry. But the SAS weren't like that. Their silence wasn't just strategy. It was culture. One night, she overheard the interpreter talking to one of the SAS troopers, while the others rested. "Why didn't you tie her up?" the interpreter asked, nodding toward her. The soldier shrugged. "If she runs, we'll find her again. But until then, we show her we're not animals." That stayed with her. She had expected humiliation. Instead, they gave her space, not much, but enough. They didn't interrogate her harshly. They didn't strip her of dignity. When she coughed, they passed her a cloth. When her hands trembled, they offered water, not threats. The youngest among them, barely older than she, was once left an open tin of meat beside her pack. He didn't say a word. He just walked away. It wasn't kindness in the way she understood it. It was something quieter, a discipline of decency. Later, one of the senior SAS men said something she never forgot. He wasn't speaking to her, but she heard it clearly. "We don't kill unless we have to. And when we do it clean." That night, Mai lay awake under the tarp they'd rigged. The rain thudded gently on the ponchos stretched overhead. She thought of the men she had met in the training camps, fiery, certain, proud. They spoke of liberation, of righteous war, of enemies without souls. But these men, these Australians, made her question everything. Their rifles were real, their eyes were alert, but their restraint, that was more dangerous than any weapon. They weren't fighting out of hatred, they were simply doing a job. And somehow, that made it harder to hate them back. It was just before dawn when he spoke to her. The jungle was wrapped in mist, dew forming on ponchos and rifle slings. Most of the SAS patrol was either asleep or silently prepping for the day's move. But the patrol commander, the quiet one with grey at his temples, sat down beside her, cross-legged, like he wasn't her captor, just another tired soul trying to survive the war. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask questions like an interrogator. Instead, he said, in slow, deliberate English, "I had a daughter. She'd be about your age now." Mai didn't respond. He paused, glancing toward the dim outline of the treetops. The mist drifted between them like a veil. She used to braid flowers into her hair, hated the idea of me coming here, thought I'd die in someone else's war. Mai finally looked at him. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, tired. "And do you think it is your war?" He nodded once. "Not at first. But now. I just try to keep my men alive. I don't hate you. I don't even know you. I just do the job." There was no bitterness in his tone. Just weary honesty. It disarmed her more than any threat could. She surprised herself by replying, "I didn't want to fight either, but they came to our village, promised freedom, promised revenge for my father. It's hard to say no when everyone else says yes." He nodded again, as if Head heard that story before, from the other side of the world. Then came a silence not of tension, but of shared fatigue. Two people from opposite ends of a battlefield, staring at the same fog. He stood slowly. "You'll be moved soon. I can't say what will happen next, but I'll make sure they know you were treated fairly." She didn't thank him, not with words. But when he turned to go, she said, almost to herself, "My name isn't Mai. That was my sister's name. She died 2 years ago." He paused. "Thank you," he said gently, "for trusting me with that." For the rest of the morning, they said nothing more, but something had shifted. The war didn't stop. The jungle didn't change. But in that brief, unguarded moment, the lines between enemy and human blurred, if only for a little while. And for Mai, that single conversation would linger long after the chains, the transport trucks, and the interrogation rooms. Not because of what was said, but because someone had finally listened. The war had no space for tenderness. At least, that was what Mai had believed. Compassion was a luxury for civilians, for those far from the smell of sweat and damp earth and blood. In the jungle, survival came first. Ideology came second. Everything else, kindness, comfort, trust, was just weakness waiting to be punished. But the days she spent under the watch of the Australian SAS made her question all of that. It wasn't just that they fed her, or that they never struck her. It was the small, silent gestures, things that required no orders, no reward, just decency. One of the troopers, tall and quiet, noticed that her bare feet were blistered. He said nothing, but that evening, after patrol, he left a pair of worn jungle boots near her pack. Not new, but dry. Her size. She hesitated to wear them at first, wondering if it was a trick, but in the end, her aching soles made the choice for her. Another time, as the rain hammered down and the cold crept into her bones, she curled herself tighter under the rough blanket they'd given her. When she opened her eyes the next morning, someone had silently laid a second poncho over her during the night. No words, just action. Even the interpreter, a South Vietnamese man who had little reason to sympathize with a VC, began treating her more gently as the days passed. He once brought her a tin of sweet milk and said in a soft voice, "You remind me of my cousin. She was your age." It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something harder to define, something human. She had been trained to expect enemies, but these men weren't trying to break her spirit. They weren't interested in revenge. They weren't angry. They were tired, disciplined, efficient, but also strangely respectful. She caught glimpses of them in their unguarded moments, sharing water, tending to leeches on each other's legs, quietly watching the jungle for signs of ambush. They weren't monsters. They were just men trying to make it through. One evening, she heard them laughing, not loudly, just a low chuckle between two of them over some old joke or memory from back home. That laugh struck her more than any gunshot. It reminded her of her brother, before he vanished in an American bombing raid. She closed her eyes. She didn't know if she was remembering the war or forgetting it. But for a moment, she allowed herself to believe something she never thought possible, that even in war, people could choose to remain human, and those who did were more dangerous than bullets. They made you see the enemy as a mirror, and mirrors, Mai knew, were hard to break. The order came on the 5th day. A chopper would arrive at a temporary landing zone near the edge of the jungle. Mai was to be transferred to a rear compound under ARVN and Allied control. From there, she would be questioned more formally. The war would continue its usual course names: interrogation forms, intelligence briefings, reports, but the men who had captured her said nothing. There was no ceremony, no goodbyes, just the quiet, methodical movements of men packing up for the next leg of a patrol. Rifles checked, packs hoisted, radios tested. For them, it was just another operation, another day in the long, invisible war. But for Mai, something felt heavier. She sat on a tree stump near the edge of the clearing, boots now laced around her blistered feet, the scarf folded neatly in her lap. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Gratitude wasn't appropriate. Apology didn't fit either. These men had neither embraced her nor condemned her, and maybe that was what made it so hard to leave. The patrol commander approached her. He didn't offer a handshake, just a nod. "You'll be safe where you're going," they've been told. Mai looked up, and for the first time, she met his eyes without fear. Not as prisoner to captor, not even as enemy to enemy, just as two people who had seen what war does to young faces. She hesitated, then said quietly, "I don't know your name, but I won't forget you." He nodded again. That was enough. The chopper arrived in a cloud of wind and leaves. As she stepped aboard, she looked back one last time. The men had already turned to melt into the jungle, weapons in hand, eyes forward. They didn't wave, they didn't linger. Ghosts never did. But the silence they left behind said everything. She would go on. So would they. The war would claim more villages, more lives, more names whispered in the trees. But for those 5 days in the jungle, there had been no victors or villains, only people. And sometimes that was the most subversive act in war. To see each other not as ideologies, not as targets, but as humans, sharing the same mud, the same hunger, the same sky. Mai held the scarf tighter as the helicopter lifted into the mist. Somewhere below, the jungle closed behind 6 men who didn't need medals to remember what they'd done, and one woman who would never forget how her enemy chose not to hate her. Years passed. The war ended, as all wars eventually do, not with peace, but with exhaustion. Cities were renamed. Flags changed. Uniforms disappeared. Graves multiplied. Mai survived. She never told anyone exactly how. Her records listed her as missing for a short time, then detained, then returned. No one asked for details. No one wanted to know what happened in that brief window when she vanished from her unit and reappeared in a prisoner transfer. She married once, quietly, had 2 children, worked as a nurse in a small district hospital. Life moved on, like the Mekong after flood season, muddy, heavy, unstoppable. But every year, when the rains returned and the air turned thick with memory, she would pause. And remember, not the battles, not the slogans, not the fear. She remembered 6 men in the jungle, Australian SAS, faces painted green, eyes sharp, voices soft. She remembered the poncho someone laid over her, the boots left without a word, the man who spoke of his daughter and never asked for her confession. They never tried to win her over, never asked her to switch sides. They didn't humiliate her, convert her, or even pity her. They simply chose to act in the middle of war with restraint. It wasn't mercy, it was discipline, and it changed her more than any ideology ever had. In old age, when her granddaughter once asked her what scared her most during the war, Mai didn't talk about bombs or ambushes, or the night she nearly drowned crossing a flooded river. She said, "The scariest moment was when I realized the enemy I was taught to hate looked at me as a human being, and I didn't know what to do with that." Her granddaughter didn't understand, not fully. That was okay. Some truths take a lifetime to settle. Sometimes, the most powerful act in war isn't the shot fired but the one withheld. And sometimes, what survives after all the flags fall and the names fade from the memorials is not who won or lost, but who chose to remain human.